So I didn't introduce myself. I'm Sean Gio. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the Partnership for Strong Community. Kaylee Pratt, Senior Policy Analyst, is also on the call. So this is the second day of the Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference 2022. You've probably been in other sessions today, but this year's session is focused on building stability, and we're trying to spotlight in each session a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. In this case, we'll be talking about A30G. Join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2022 on Twitter, and you can follow us at PSC Housing there if you haven't already. Today's session is titled A30G, History, Facts, and Myths. We first want to thank our leading sponsors, Department of Housing, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, La Rosa Building Group, the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. We also have several collaborating sponsors. You can see them here. And quite a few supporting sponsors, a lot of our partners and friends. And last but not least, I want to give a big thank you to the sponsor for this session, Hinckley Allen. One just announcement, Partnership for Strong Communities puts out housing data profiles, housing data and demographic information for each municipality in the state. We've recently updated that information this week. We launched that. So you can check out these profiles for every town and for every county in the state at pschousing.org. And we'll put a link into the chat to get directly to the profiles. Okay, so now we're getting ready to start. I will just very quickly introduce our guests, really the three leading experts on Section 830G in the state. Professor Nika Singh-Lamar from Yale will be moderating our panel. Raphael Podolsky from Connecticut Legal Services, and Timothy Hollister from Hinckley Allen. So I'll leave it to each of you if you want to introduce yourself some more, but I'll take it away, Anika.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thank you all for joining us today. What I'm going to ask, I don't need to be further introduced, but I'm going to ask Rafi and Tim, I'm going to start off with some questions for you, and before you answer your first question, if you want to introduce yourself further, please do. The thing that I'll say about both Rafi and Tim is that they have been around since day one on Connecticut's Anti-SNOB Zoning Act, more commonly known as the Affordable Housing Appeals Act being the technical term, or Section 830G, which is the numerical term. But anti-SNOB zoning, which is how Massachusetts describes its act on which 830G is based, is much more descriptive. And what I'd like to do is maybe start with Tim. If you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the statute, where it came from, how it got started, something about the housing market and the dynamics that led up to it, and how you'd compare that to what's going on in the market here in Connecticut and nationally today.
Very good. Well, hello, everybody. Nice to see you all in virtual land. I am a land use and environmental lawyer at Hinckley Allen in Hartford, and I've been doing affordable housing law now for just shy of 40 years. And as I always say, I have the scars to prove it. But to answer your question, Anika, I think the starting point for everybody to explain where 830G came from is the structure of land use and land use governance in Connecticut, and the fact that we have 169 towns, and each town has independent land use responsibility and authority. And in most cases, that authority is independent of the town's legislative body, whether it's the town council or the town meeting or whatever. So it's the municipal boundaries that are the basic building block or organizational block of land use power. And those are just historical artifacts. It's not like the legislature created a land use system and chose the town boundaries as the ideal way to administrate it. It was just the towns were there, and that was where the power was delegated. And it's also important to remember this was done 100 years ago. And at that time, basically one of the goals of the establishment of zoning statewide was to allow towns to enforce and impose racial and economic and sometimes even religious segregation. So that system is carried through, and throughout this history, the Zoning Enabling Act, also written in the 1920s, is this broad font of authority that gives the zoning commissions in each town authority over a broad range of subjects to adopt regulations, grant or deny permits, and relatively few prohibitions on their power. And also the commissions historically, actually until this year, have been staffed by untrained volunteers, often well-meaning, but not formally, versed in the required to be versed in the complex legal and technical issues that they decide on a regular basis. And this broad base of authority is basically unchecked, had been unchecked by the local, by the statewide judicial system. There's a mantra of judicial deference to the local decision making, both in regulations and in permit making. So what are the consequences of this structure? Commissions tend to focus on the four corners of the town. I'll use the word parochial and not really in a denigrating sense, but it just happens to be that their focus is what they think is good for the town and a preference for the status quo. So fast forward to the 1980s, when most government intervention in the housing market was financial subsidies for new construction or rehabilitation. In the 1980s, the housing market and the economy in the United States, indeed the world, boomed, fueled mid-decade by the so-called Reagan tax cut, which unleashed a tremendous amount of investment. So housing prices began to escalate very rapidly. One quick example, in 1982, I had a chance to buy a condo in Hartford for $79,000. My salary was $27,000. I couldn't buy it. 2 years later, that unit sold for $200,000, and that was not unusual. So a pattern developed of escalating prices against the backdrop of local decision-making reinforced by judicial deference, and a pattern developed that when proposals were made at the local level for higher density, lower income, requiring more municipal services perceived as changing the character of the town, the proposals were routinely denied, and what was getting approved was large homes on single-family homes on large lots, viewed as essentially creating better property tax opportunities and less in the way of services. And the courts were deferring to those decisions. So that was a way of increasing segregation. Meanwhile, and I'll just finish with this for the background, in Massachusetts, you had the adoption as far back as 1969 of a state law providing for a state agency override if low and moderate income housing proposals were denied. And then in New Jersey, you had the adoption in the mid-70s of the so-called Mount Laurel doctrine or fair share. And then finally, Connecticut in 1988, you had the Connecticut Supreme Court weighing in the builder's service case, which said that basically a minimum floor area of 1,200 square feet for a single family home without regard to public health or the number of occupants was exclusionary zoning, was economic segregation, and not a proper purpose of zoning. So in 1988, the Governor O'Neill established this Blue Ribbon Commission. So they had to look at three things: rising prices, the degree of local discretion, and what to do about judicial deference. And at that point, I'll turn it over to Rafi because he was a member of that commission.
Okay, Tim, thank you. Yes, I was a member of that commission, and also in 2000 of a second Blue Ribbon Commission that dealt with 8-30G. The first Blue Ribbon Commission was not focused on on what was going to become 8-30G at all. It started in 1987, submitted a report in 1988, and it recommended that Connecticut adopt the Massachusetts system. And the Massachusetts system was a 5-member board that was essentially a wing of that state's Department of Housing. And you would take an administrative appeal if you as a developer were turned down. And they had a standard they applied. Over 90% of the time the application was approved at that level. That was what was proposed in 1988. It did not move in this Connecticut legislature. Meanwhile, the Blue Ribbon Commission was still going because it went for 2 years. And on the second round at the commission, people said, in this state, they simply, the legislature is not going to give a state administrative agency the power to do this kind of review. What we have now is our appeals to the court. You don't like a zoning decision, you take an appeal to the court. Let's take a look at what would happen if we tried to get to a similar approach, but we did it not through a state agency, but rather through the judicial system, because people take zoning appeals anyway. But in order to make it workable, you can't use existing zoning appeals because they'll always lose. The appeals are going to go on whether the zone, whether the developer wants more density than the zone permits. You have to be able to say that the zone has to be able to accept more density. And you have to have some sort of balancing structure to do that. And so what the Blue Ribbon Commission did was it took the Massachusetts legal standard that was being applied and it converted it to a judicial review standard if you met certain threshold elements to show that you were doing enough affordability to justify giving the extra weight that this would give on an appeal. And that's what we ended up passing in 1989. It took effect, I believe, in July of 1990. And that's where 8-30G came from. For the first decade, the degree of affordability that was required for a developer to meet that threshold was pretty low. And there was a lot of attack and criticism on 8-30G that it was allowing developers who were not really doing anything substantially affordable, especially in Lower Fairfield County, to use the statute when the amount of affordability they were providing was not all that much. At that time was borrowed from Massachusetts. The standard was 20% of the units had to be reserved for 20 years for households below 80% of area median. Lower Fairfield County area median is very high, and 20%, 20 years is a relatively modest requirement for a developer. That led to a new commission in 1999 and 2000. And that commission came in with the recommendations that have essentially shaped 8-30G for what it is today. There have been reviews and there have been some changes, but the core of what we have now was adopted in 2000, not in 1990. And what the single most important thing, well, it did several things. It upped the affordability requirement to what was seen as about as high as you could go without discouraging people from doing any development at all. So the 20 years worked its way up to 40 years of deed restriction. The 20% of the units being for people below 80% of area median changed, first of all, statewide median rather than area median. Second of all, 30% had to be the set aside, and half of that set aside had to be for households below 60% of median. And in Lower Fairfield County, that particularly makes a huge difference because statewide median is much, much lower, or statewide median is much lower than area median there. So that became the model. It also tried to find ways, the commission tried to find ways to make the whole process more palatable to towns and address the issue of some of the more prosperous towns saying, we're never going to be able to get out of this. We're never going to get to 10%. And the result was some additional informational requirements that municipalities could insist upon. And more important, there would be an intermediate moratorium. And the moratorium was designed to say to towns that are below 10% on the measure. And if I have time before you cut me off, Anika, I'll say something about the measure.
You're not going to have time, right?
Okay, but basically to say, if you show significant progress towards not any particular percentage goal measured by the 10%, but rather to substantial development in your town of low cost, of housing that satisfies the requirements of 8-30G, which is not affordable, a total misnomer, but is government assisted or long-term affordability deed restricted. If you make significant progress, then you can get what became a 4-year moratorium. And that four-year moratorium was not for the purpose of saying you're done, there's nothing else to be done. It's to give the town 4 years to using its own priorities and its own focusing on affordable housing to stimulate the development of an additional batch of housing. So it used a 2% measure. The 2% measure is incentivized in numerous ways, which I won't go over now unless somebody asks me a question. But the result is towns could get a second moratorium or a third moratorium or a fourth moratorium if they continued, if they did things that would encourage the development of affordable housing. And there are towns, I believe 3 or 4 towns that have gotten a second moratorium, and it's down the road, there may be towns that get a third. So it's something, it was doable. It directly met the argument that towns that starting low would never be able to get higher. The 10% figure, as I said, and this is important to understand, is not about some generalized lay definition of affordability. It was never meant to be. It was a trigger as to who's in the act and who's not in the act. And the trigger was if you are heavily impacted by government-assisted housing or essentially housing that's built under the act, deed restricted, then you won't be under the act. Otherwise, you're under the act. You don't have to do anything if you don't want to. It just means developers will have access to a development tool. Okay,
Sure.
I'll stop
So
for now.
thanks, Rafi. So let's talk a little bit about what that tool is. So this panel is intended to get at myths and misconceptions around 830G, of which there are many. And Rafi's already started to talk about some of them. I think one thing we've got to do in leading into that conversation about myths and misperceptions is talk a little bit about what the statute does do, and then spend a good amount of time talking about what it doesn't do. So briefly, Tim, if you would, what is it that the statute does? I think the perception among some is that it is a way for developers to bypass all rule of law and cram developments down where they do not belong for one reason or another. What is it that the statute actually does? What is this tool that Rafi alluded to?
Okay, well, as I always explain it to property owners, developers who are new to it, 830G offers a property owner / developer a deal. If you agree to preserve 30%, this is the set aside, there's 2 types of models. The set aside model, if you agree to preserve 30% of your units for 40 years for low and moderate income households, and as Rafi said, within that 30%, half at 80% of median and half at 60% of median being the lower of the statewide or the area, and you go to the zoning commission and you get denied, and you go to court with an appeal, the burden shifts to the zoning commission to prove that its denial was based on a substantial public health and safety interest that clearly outweighs the need for affordable housing in the town and cannot be addressed by reasonable changes to the development plan. So basically the zoning committee, it's a shifting of the burden of proof. People always forget it's a judicial review standard. The zoning process, I mean, obviously the zoning process is shaped by the judicial review standard, but it doesn't change anything procedurally really about the local zoning process. So it's a burden shifting process that in the courts that affects what happens at the local level. And you know, you said, is it a way that you know, developers can ignore the rules? The best thing I can say is that, and I always, almost every hearing I get to comes to this, I have to explain, you know, if you're an 830G developer, you as the developer have the highest stake in making sure that what's going to be developed is going to be lovely and attractive and people are going to want to live there. The opponents and criticizers always say, oh, this is going to be, you know, ugly and poorly maintained. Well, no, because people have, the applicant is going to make a very substantial financial and other investment and wants to come out with a development that is going to be, you know, livable and a credit to the community. And, you know, a lot of things get criticized in the front end, but generally when they're built, they say, oh, that's not so bad, or that's nice, or I'd like to live there. So we end up there. So it's not a way to ignore quality or even the regulations. You still have to have a development plan that works and is going to fit into the market.
Can I add something to it? Anika, can I add
Sure.
something? One of the things that's important is this is a zoning, sort of a zoning and planning law. It doesn't apply to anything other than planning and zoning commissions. And so nothing in this law gets a developer out of having to meet the normal standard for any other thing that would require any kind of governmental approval, whether it's state approval or local approval. There may sometimes be some indirect aspect, but you can't. A developer could prevail at a zoning commission because 8-30G might allow a greater density by using 8-30G and through burden shifting, but that does not address any of the other kinds of fire code issues or water code issues or conservation commission issues that would still have to be met. And so it's important to realize that. So it's never a blank check. The second thing that I just want to say, because it's important for me to get out there, 8-30G is a very, very important statute precisely because it's what they sometimes call a builder's remedy. That's to say, unlike a planning statute that simply creates some opportunities but doesn't necessarily produce any construction, you have to have a project if you're going to apply to use 8-30G. So the odds that something will get built if the development proposal is approved are very high. They're not certain, but they're very high. And that makes a difference. And because of that, it produces results that go well beyond simply having a certain amount of zoning. And what I've said to people is, if you think about the Zoning Enabling Act, which requires towns to promote and be friendly to greater density in housing and housing that will serve the entire range of population within the region. If you look at that, in certain ways, 8-30G is an enforcement tool. And it's really the only enforcement tool out there. And without it, there really is no substantial incentive for towns to meet their obligations under 8-2, which is the Zoning Enabling Act. And so that no matter what other proposals are made, 8-30G to a large extent, I think, is the force behind them. You could not, for example, trade 8-30G off for some other proposal, because those proposals won't work unless you have 8-30G with strength and in place. And so I just think it's important to understand that and see some of these interconnections, but it is absolutely not a way that a developer can simply go make up his own rules and do whatever he wants. Indeed, even on the zoning statute, a significant number of cases are won by municipalities. They're not all won by developers, and they're not won at the percentage of success that they are in Massachusetts, which uses an administrative agency as the decider rather than the court system, which is more neutral.
Sure, and I think one thing I just add about Massachusetts, which in addition to being an administrative route, which makes it less costly for both the developers and the exclusionary towns, it is called a comprehensive permit system for a reason. The reason being that that single process also takes you through, for example, the sewer permit. Here in Connecticut, Tim, do you want to talk a little bit about the various kinds of barriers that developers of affordable housing and the tenants who would like to live in those developments were they to be built must surmount in order to build a building outside of planning and zoning?
Well, sewage disposal, whether it's public sewers or some alternative treatment system or a community septic system, is always very high on the initial due diligence checklist. Water supply, wetlands is always an issue if there's wetlands on or near the property. State Traffic Commission, if it's a larger development, it's going to be a major traffic generator that's going to be under the jurisdiction of the OSTA, Office of State Traffic Administration. There could be a historic district certificate of appropriateness. There could theoretically be a variance, although we try to steer away from that because it's very complicated to match up 830G with the variance standards, so we shy away from that. But those are the major ones, and this is not lost on the towns or opponents. If you are against an 830G proposal, you look for one of these permits that is not covered by 830G, and you make your stand. So that's one reason I have a job.
Yeah, I'd add to that list. I may have missed it, but historic preservation is another one that doesn't get covered by 830G. And basically every kind of public health or environmental standard must still be met, even if a developer is able to win the 830G battle against a SNOP town. They've got to get over these other hurdles as well. There's a comment in the chat about this, what I would call the 10% myth. And Rafi, you've already alluded to this a little bit, but I wonder if you could dig in a little bit more. I mean, one thing you hear from proponents of discriminatory and exclusionary zoning is that a failure of 830G is that the 10% does not include housing that just happens to be lower cost. And that if what we care about is affordable housing, why doesn't the 10% include housing that's lower cost? I've got my own answer to that, but it is admittedly derivative of one I heard from you some years ago. So let's go to the source. How do you respond to that?
In some ways, this is the term affordable was used in a technical sense and not in a lay sense. And ironically, the reason for doing that was the old term was low and moderate income housing. And people, although low and moderate income housing includes a wide range of incomes, people back in the 1980s thought that was a secret way of saying public housing. And the developers of 8-30G did not see this as being, well, theoretically public housing could be included. And there are a couple of housing authorities that have used it. They saw it as more like workforce housing and thought that by calling it low and moderate income housing, it would be completely misperceived as public housing. So somebody had the creative idea of saying, well, why don't we call it affordable housing? That way it'll be different. It won't be misconceived. But what it meant was government assisted housing. And that was all that it meant. And it was a switch, a trigger as to whether you were or were not covered in the act. And it was essentially borrowed from Massachusetts. The 10% figure came from the Massachusetts statute. The inclusion of set-aside housing within that as a second category in the 10% was because it doesn't seem to make sense not to include the housing that was built under the act itself as counting towards the 10%. But the 10% also counts things that are not construction. For example, it counts rent subsidies. If you have a Section 8 or a RAP, that counts towards the 10%. So it's going beyond a construction count. It includes CHFA first-time homebuyer mortgages, again, which is not a construction count. But the purpose was to take a snap in time every year and see where the town was. But those are government assisted. Those are still government assisted, to see where government assisted housing is in that town. If it's got more than 10% of its housing units as being government assisted, like Hartford or like New Haven or like Bridgeport, it's heavily impacted by government assisted housing, then they decided there's no need to include that in 8-30G. It made it for an easy measure. If you were going to include low-cost housing across the board, which is what people sometimes think affordable means, then there is no way that you would ever seriously consider using 10% as your threshold requirement. You would have, because who would say that if a town is 90% unaffordable in its housing, it's fine with us. We're not gonna apply this law. You would use 70% or 75 or 80 or 85% as your threshold, so that you would essentially exempt the same 30 towns that you're going to exempt with the 10% standard. So, but that confusion of terminology has led to people saying, well, we've got more than 10% of our units that are, quote, affordable. Well, yeah, probably most of your units are affordable to the people who live in them, but that's not the rationale for why you would or would not be an 8-30G for purposes of assessing development. And so that's kind of where that came from. And if you were going to leave and not just count government assisted housing, then you really would have to totally revamp your percentage for a set aside. And otherwise you're simply exempting everybody. And you don't, and so in fact, that at one point, one year, a state representative from Stratford put in a bill to require developers to impose it like a 50% standard. I mean, it was obvious that the purpose was simply to exempt everybody without requiring anyone to do anything. So that's sort of the history on that, and I think it's really important, and people need to not be understand that that the term affordable is used in a very precise technical way in the statute. If I could, I would have somebody think up a different word. Keep the statute intact, but have a different word for what we're calling those developments.
I have a quick, simple math way to explain why the 10% is not a policy goal. If you think about it, affordable housing is generally discussed as affordable to those earning 80% or less of the median income. The median income is the 50% level, 80% of that is 40%. It is not the housing policy of the state of Connecticut that if you have 10% of your housing units as affordable to meet 40% of the need, that's sufficient.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You guys both hit it on the nail on the head, that if the goal here were to capture every unit that just was reasonably cost, then we would flip the percentages from 10 to 90 and vice versa. The idea that anybody with a straight face could think that if 10% of your units are affordable to first year, second grade teachers, that that means you're fine has deep misunderstanding of what the need in the state is and how regular people live. Another myth that you sometimes hear is that the statute has not worked, in the sense that it has not created a substantial number of units. Tim, might you respond to that one?
Sure. For a number of years, probably going back to something that I wrote in 2005 or 2006, the number that was bandied about was 5,000 units produced under 830G. That was probably true in the mid 2000s, but earlier this year, my colleague Andrea Gomes and I, using publicly available data, did come up with a defensible methodology, which is basically to go back and look at housing production from 2002, which was the first 10% list, through 2021, the most recent, and look at the increase in assisted units and the number of so-called set-aside units. I won't walk you through all the methodology, but our estimate was that over the 31-year life of the statute, approximately 8,500 units of deed-restricted housing have been produced, and 18,000 units of not necessarily deed-restricted, but lower-cost housing. Remember, in a 30% set-aside, that also brings with it 70% market rate units, which generally are not as expensive as those in a building that is 100% market rate. So we came up with those two numbers, put it out on the web. I believe it was passed around by the state chapter of the American Planning Association. And we invited anybody who had a better idea on the methodology to chime in, and we haven't heard anything. So I think as a ballpark numbers, those are what we came up with. And, would we love it if it was 50,000 units? Sure. But my mantra is one unit at a time. Every one of those units is a family that has a housing opportunity that it would not otherwise have had.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one thing I think that's misunderstood is how that compares to how many units we build using public subsidies, for example, and what the cost of publicly subsidized. An alternative here is to spend a lot more money on government subsidized affordable housing or on vouchers. And we ought to do that. I think the three of us agree that we ought to do that, and probably many of the attendees agree that we ought to do that. But if we were to double the amount of money that the state spends on its subsidy programs, we might build a few hundred additional units in a given year. So the resources are nowhere near what the need is when you consider the tens of thousands of Connecticut residents that are low income and rent burdened, extremely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income every year on rent. I'm going to ask folks in the audience, if you've got questions, if you could put them in the chat, and then I'll pick them out as we go. And if you'd prefer to ask your question anonymously, or at least almost anonymously, you can direct message me in the chat, and I will not disclose your name. And while I'm waiting for folks to do that, I'll ask one more question of my own. One thing that you hear from, again, kind of defenders of the unaffordable and exclusionary status quo is that zoning is a local power and that the state ought not mess with it. One thing I thought that was interesting, Tim, you were saying when the initial Zoning Enabling Act was passed, it was passed with not a lot of restrictions on what local governments could do. And that's true. But one thing that's also true of that era is the people who wrote that model act that got adopted by the various states, including here in Connecticut, is that they thought the courts would limit what local governments could do. So one pretty interesting example of that is that the initial authors of the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act thought that single-family zoning was probably unconstitutional because it probably violated the Fifth Amendment's prohibition on takings. So they thought there were limitations. They just didn't write them into the act. They assumed that the courts would enforce some reasonable limitations, and that you couldn't just sort of zone crazy things like single-family only zones and fast forward 100 years, and that's not how things turned out. So how do you all think about that argument that we often hear, that zoning is local, hands off my zoning, hands off our schools, the state should just go away, these towns can take care of themselves?
Well, as a legal matter in Connecticut, that is simply not true. There are three models of local government powers in the United States. There's so-called constitutional home rule, where the state constitution reserves powers to the towns. There's delegated home rule. And then there's what we have in Connecticut, which is called Dillon's rule, which is the most restrictive, which basically means that towns in Connecticut have only those powers expressly delegated by the legislature, those powers necessarily implied from an express delegation. We are a top-down state. And by the way, you know, we always talk about local zoning. Think about it. Zoning is basically the only power of its type that is exercised at the local level. The utilities, environmental protection, traffic, taxation, everything is, except local land use, is governed by one state agency with a uniform set of rules. So zoning is the exception, but zoning powers, even 8-2, as broad as it is a creature of the state legislature giving the power to the towns. And to use the biblical phrase, what the state giveth, the state can taketh away. And, you know, I've written recently about, you know, the whole issue with the state legislature and housing is, okay, if we see something at the local level that we don't like, how much power do we withdraw from the towns and how do we do it? And that was Public Act 2129 last year. It was 830G when it was adopted. The legislature is monitoring how the Zoning Enabling Act is being used or misused or not used, and is selectively pruning the local powers, but it's the state legislature that is in charge as a practical and legal matter. The zoning is not a local initiative.
I'd like to add something to that because people forget, and this comes from what Tim said, people forget that if there was no zoning enabling act at all, if 8-2 did not exist, the result would not be towns can do any kind of zoning they want. The result would be anybody can develop anything they want anywhere in the town as kind of a right of private property. The zoning exists for the purpose of limiting what can be done at various times and places, but only to the extent that the state has delegated. And that's what Tim said. And if you look at the existing zoning act, a year ago, they reorganized the legislature reorganized the act so that it now looks like a rational statute with subsections and numbered things. But it used to be essentially one long paragraph for dozens and dozens and dozens of lines. And if you looked at it and read it, you would see what all those lines were about were state restrictions and requirements. Towns must do this if they're going to have zoning, or they may not do something else. So it's not some new creation of 8-30G that requires the towns to promote what essentially is regional diversity in housing, but just one of many, many requirements that are conditions of towns being able to have zoning in the first place. So it's worth thinking about that. When people tell you zoning is local, it is local because it's being applied in to specific pieces of land in specific towns, but it is very much conditioned on meeting certain state policy standards and always has been, all the way back to the 1920s. So that's really what zoning is about. It's to give towns some degree of discretion, not unlimited discretion.
Great. So we have a great question in the chat, which is, can you use 830G to build a homeownership model meeting the income limitations set out in the statute?
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, remember in Connecticut, we have a state statute that not an affordable statute. It says you can convert rental to ownership and ownership to rental pretty much as of right. So that you can build something as an 830G rental and it can be converted to condominiums and vice versa. I will say that the predominant model under 830G has been rental, which is mostly because I think the ease of administration of the income restriction, it gets a little bit more difficult if you're dealing with ownership units that only turn over X number of years. But there's absolutely a way to do it, that it has to make financial sense, but it is absolutely available to ownership. And I'll just say, interestingly, of course, with interest rates going up, that means that the affordable prices on 830G for ownership housing are going down because they work inversely, which may mean that over the next couple of years that even more of the market for 830G development will trend toward rental, even more than it has in recent years. That's speculation, but seems to be the way it's worked in a couple of recent downturns. Yeah,
that's interesting. There's my take on why most of them recently are rental and not home ownership. And there have been home ownership 830Gs, yes. Not recently a whole lot. My take on why is a little different. I don't actually think the administrability on the home ownership is all that hard from a developer's perspective, because it goes into a deed restriction, and it's almost self-effectuating, especially if the town's actually doing its job of oversight, which, as Tim and Rafe know, most towns don't bother because they don't really care whether the housing is affordable, but they should. I don't think it's administrability. I think it's the market. I just think it's the market. Because of the zoning, we've underproduced rental housing for so long that's where the gap is. So the tool that exists, to the extent that it exists, is going to get used where there's the most demand relative to the ability to meet that demand based on the regulations, which is the overregulation of the zoning. Another question out of the chat. via a direct message. Thank you for that. Are there any towns that come to mind that do a particularly good job of educating their whiniest voices about what 830G actually is and the benefits of affordable housing, and the unlikelihood that the kind of parade of horribles that people will cite when testifying against affordable housing, the unlikelihood that those things will actually occur? Are there any towns that come to mind as exemplars of doing the right thing here and not giving in to the angry hordes of NIMBYs?
Farmington. Just 2 weeks ago approved a low-income housing tax credit development, 65 units in partnership with a local housing supportive housing organization called FAVAR. 2 hearings, unanimous approval, very savvy commission, I mean, good plan and good location, developed by Jeff Sager and his daughter Phoebe Sager at Sager Development. But I've worked a fair amount in Farmington, and they have a great staff and a great commission, and they're right at the top of the list.
Right. That parade of horribles that people cite. So stresses on school systems, which stresses on school systems, traffic, crime, the things that people complain about loudly and frequently at these public hearings when a land use board is considering affordable or multifamily housing. Do they actually come to be when a development is built thanks to 830G?
No.
And is there any social science that studies that more broadly?
Well, the studies that we have are that a multifamily affordable, if properly done, which you would expect it to be, does not have a negative impact on the property values of neighboring single family homes. Now that, I think, is the sort of the umbrella under which there's the crime that people say is going to materialize, the impacts on the school system, which, by the way, is not a legally relevant criteria, but people bring it up anyway. The impacts don't materialize, and and this is actually not even endemic to affordable housing. Anytime, in my experience, development is change. It's different than what people are used to, and people come out and make up stuff. Sometimes they overstate their criticism that may have have some factual basis, but and then there's other people that are I think more realistic. But you see that's why we have land use commissions and land use hearings, is to put those out in the public forum and vet them. And but I think you could go around the state. There are probably 85 or 90 built, developed, occupied 830Gs around the state. If you can show me one that has turned out to be a complete detriment to the neighborhood around it, go ahead and let us know, because we haven't seen that. Always turns out better in the end than the naysayers project.
Yeah, there is. I think that is true. And in fact, if it weren't true, you'd hear a lot more about it, right? So the horror stories that people parade when they testify before the legislature, for example, are always about proposed projects and not built projects, which is notable. You would think legislators would notice that more than they do. But there is also social science on this. And one thing that I'd recommend, and the partnership actually hosted an event with the author of this book a few years ago, Doug Massey at Princeton, has a book called Climbing Mount Laurel, which looks at the development that was built as a result of the decades-long Mount Laurel litigation, which resulted in a multifamily development in the town of Mount Laurel, which is a suburb of Camden in Philadelphia, and looked at impacts on the things that people said would be impacted. So again, schools, traffic, taxes. Thank you, Sean, for putting the link in the meeting chat. and found that none of the bad things came to be. None of them, not a one. And in fact, when they polled neighbors of the development, neighbors said, what affordable housing? They didn't know it was affordable housing, right? Once it was built. Because it was indistinguishable from other kinds of development, right? It didn't scream public housing lives here. But they also looked at the impacts on the people who got to live in that housing and found rather substantial impacts, particularly on kids and also on parents who actually had better access to jobs and the like. So their uptake on various public subsidies actually went down as they were more likely to be in the workforce and whatnot as a result of residing in that housing. And that was 100% affordable development, not a 20 or 30% as you would see with a 30G. We've got another question in the chat, which is, Tim, can you talk about what you just alluded to, that impacts on schools, number of children is not a relevant criterion when considering whether to approve a proposed housing development?
Yeah, these are court cases that go back in the to the 1950s. Property tax impact is not a relevant criteria in a Connecticut land use decision, and school impacts are not. Public education is an obligation of the town, and zoning commissions are directed to not look at, you know, thumbs up or thumbs down based on perceived impacts on the school system. Now, of course, the reality is, and I mentioned this in my opening, in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we always had that question come up: how many school children, and you know, what are their ages going to be? And you know, we had to got into demographic multipliers. But of course, in recent years, most towns, not all, but most towns, the school population is declining, and so that has become a, maybe if not non-existent, but a very much muted factor than what we saw previously. But you know, the commissions are legally not supposed to look at property tax and school impacts in their decision making. Any town attorney should advise their commission of that reality. So
The other Nika, also, I don't have the data, but someone like Sean May from because the partnership collects this sort of data, but by and large, apartment complexes tend to have fewer children per unit than do single family houses. That I think that there is data out there that says the major additions to children in the school system come from single family houses because they're designed to hold more people, and apartments are sort of designed by and large to hold fewer people. So that the assumption that having apartment, particularly on the rental side, creating rental apartments is going to have a major impact on the school system. I think objectively it's been determined that's not true, but there are also reasons why it's not true and why you wouldn't expect it to be true, anyway. So
yeah, you're both exactly right. It's not a relevant or lawful consideration. Also, what people think is true turns out not to be true. And I just want to highlight that the fact that people bring it up points to the reason why zoning is not an exclusively local decision. Like, we as a state don't relish the idea that the number of children and families with children would be declining. That sounds like a dying state. The fact that towns would like to see the number of children plateau or decline suggests that any individual town's policy priorities are not in line with what we would want to see as a state. And so the fact that the state would step in and say, you know, that's not a real, we don't want you to take that into consideration. Or if you're going to say things like that, then we're going to draw some lines around what it is that you're allowed to zone and not zone. Makes perfect sense, right? But yeah, you guys are both absolutely right that it's neither relevant nor is what people say true. So I think we've got time for maybe one last question. I'm going to pull it from the chat. you know, 830G was never intended to, nor has it solved the state's affordable housing crisis. We are in perpetual housing affordability crisis mode, and maybe never so much as we are now today at this point in time, with a 2% vacancy rate and rents escalating by double percentage points by all accounts from all corners of the state. What other barriers do you both see to the implementation of the statute, and the use of the statute to building more affordable housing and multifamily housing more generally?
Well, I've said for years, if we could move more toward the Massachusetts one-stop shop model and stop this, what I'll call balkanization, where you have to go elsewhere for your sewer permit and your wetlands permit, why don't we just, and this is anathema to the environmental community, I get that. It would not pass easily, even if it was a logical way of administering and developing affordable housing. But the fact is that the system works in Massachusetts. We would do ourselves a big favor, and not in terms of just, opening the door for rampant development, but just considering each development that proposes affordable housing holistically, all the permits that you need to do it in one proceeding. And you can have your public hearings and you can have your environmental testimony, but the way we do it along separate tracks, it breeds lots of unnecessary litigation, and it's just not really a good way to run the railroad.
Rafi, you've got the last word if you want it.
Well, I don't think I don't really have a last word on this. I mean, it's the 8-30G is designed to do certain things. It is not designed to solve all of our housing problems. And it's one tool in the toolkit, and we have to recognize that. And all the other kinds of tools, some of them are construction-related tools, and what it is that would make it get more buildings built, in which a lot of that centers around the use of density. But there's also this whole area around affordability, Anika, that you mentioned, which, and I've said this many times, if I had one particular legislative proposal that I think would have a major impact on making housing more affordable for more people, I would say you go to universal rent subsidies. And that takes advantage of the existing housing. And it takes
Right, but
some of the
Rafi,
pressure
people
off
would
of
have no
new
place to
construction.
spend them. People with vouchers today have no place to spend them.
Right.
Something like 40% of people who get a voucher lose it immediately because they cannot find an apartment. So if we don't build the apartments, the vouchers are useless.
Okay. So
I took the last
there you go.
word, sorry. To bring it all back. The vouchers can only help if there are units to spend them in. And today there actually literally are not. So thanks so much to the partnership for hosting this and putting this together. Thank you to Tim and Rafi for sharing your expertise and knowledge here. And thanks all for coming and for the fabulous questions.
Thank you so much, Anika, Rafi, and Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Thank you.